So as you can see from the title, we're going to talk about open source. About myself really briefly. I don't talk about myself too much, but kind of we have 45 minutes, so let's do that. I'm an open source developer advocate at Meta. You can always go to Meta open source website to learn more about our massive portfolio. It's about 800 or so open source projects. We also have highlighted features. You can find some projects for mobile, for web, and some infrastructure projects. So whatever fits your need, you can find something from Meta open source. I currently supporting open source, but I'm also working with family of apps like business messaging. So you can also find my name there in association with Meta. And last is that I'm just genuinely passionate about open source, and that's what I'm talking about here. So while I do work with Meta open source, today I'm going to be talking more broadly about open source as a whole, with some experience, and some of the goals and the scale I'll be discussing comes with the territory, right? I work for big companies, but it can also be applied with teams of like 12 people or fewer. So, honestly, what I'm looking for from this talk, it's silly that I'm a speaker and I'm looking for something here, but really what I'm looking for is for you to grab maybe 1 or 2 points that can be applied to your project, whether it's your personal project or a project within a corporation. So, open source. What is open source? Obviously, we're at all things open, so I'm sure you've seen this definition in other places, but I will even read it out loud. It's process of making technology available for others to use and improve. Great. What I like about this definition is that it focuses on the usage, but also on the contribution, that we're ultimately working as one, as a community, to try and make it better. So why to contribute to open source? That's a great question. And so first is obviously, you want to be a part of the community, you're trying to grow your community. That's really the key piece, and that's why I always start with. There could also be a leadership goal. So you maybe as a person, or as a team, or as a corporation, trying to become a leader, known leader in the space. It can be productivity, because let's say your company, your team uses your project for, for Android, and that's really the use case you currently have, but you anticipate or you think in the future iOS might also be in the horizon. So by making it open source, you might empower your community by working with them, mentoring them, to ultimately build that iOS binding as well. So ultimately become more productive, because now it's not just 12 people working on the project, it's actually much larger community behind it. And also branding, again, because you are working with open source, it might be good for your brand. It most likely will be good for your brand, as long as you're doing it right. If you want to learn more about open source, there is a video on Meta open source YouTube channel, which you can find online, where I talked about open source. And I tried to explain it like, a viewer is 5 years old. Alrighty, so you can also find a bunch of comments and jokes that, it's too complicated, it's not for 5 years old. Still, I think it's useful information. And some of it I'll cover today. So how do you contribute to open source? Source code, kind of bring it up first because it's most obvious, but in reality I don't believe that's the one we should contribute to the most. Documentation is really more, it's make it or break it of open source project. That's where people who are outside of your silo, of you contributors, the ones who created the project, will learn from. That's the place where they'll go for questions, apart from like forums, right? So documentation is really the key, and people are always looking for contributions. And it's easy, not to say easy, it's more comforting way to enter the open source for those who've never worked with open source before. Translations, if you speak more than one language, open source project might benefit greatly by you helping with the translation. And generally speaking, the project would accept your support there. And last but not least is testing. Everyone loves to make production features, things that the end user or customer sees and uses, but nobody really wants to focus on testing. Well, that's actually the key, because the maintenance cost is really where the cost of software is, and testing helps you really to minimize that cost by making sure your software doesn't break as often, or when it breaks, potentially know where the problem is. So anyways, these are the ways you can contribute to an existing project if you're trying to kind of break into this space. And there's also a great video from one of the developer advocates at Meta. You can find it at Meta open source YouTube channel as well. It's about contributing to open source. It's a longer video, but Kemi really goes step by step in how to get started. So, what are we trying to achieve today? The goals are first to define the gaps in open source software health, provide guidelines, because I don't believe in dogmas. I don't believe that you should do everything by the book. I'll just provide you what works for us and what I've seen works for some other projects, and hopefully you'll find something that fits your style of working or the style of your organization. And lastly, and you will hear it throughout, I might not call it out loud, but really I'm implying it, communication will be the key topic, the key component of everything to do with open source. Transparency, communication, and everything that relates to that. You can even think a community and communication has the same letters, but I'm not going to even go there. So meta open source. Is there metrics that we can use to define open source generally? You know, the short answer is no. The long answer, it depends. Really consultant style answer, right? It depends. So there is some metrics, obviously, you can use. Potential health data I've seen people would employ. You know, you go to your repository, you see some numbers, right? It's number of followers or watchers, number of stars, number of comments, issues. That's one way to measure it. Another is you go for community forums. You know, it's Reddit, it's Stack Overflow, wherever else you might have a Q&A sort of place to interact with your community. Twitter, YouTube, right? If that's your goal, the follower count, subscriber count, whatever you want to call it, also might be the metrics behind your project. And lastly, there are some third-party tools out there that you can employ and find useful, right? The ones I've seen myself is the Orbit. They also have some open source stuff. The Orbit model explains how they measure open source health. And there's also kind of a newer project I've been looking at is the Common Room. Very exciting as well. I'm just glad to see more and more third-party tools focusing on attempting this extremely difficult thing with measuring success of a project. But again, I'm not going to talk about numbers, because numbers, it's, as I said, there is no silver bullet. You can't just use certain metrics and think, it worked for project A, it's going to work for project B. It will depend greatly. I showed you like brief things you can collect numbers from, but again, it's going to depend on your situation, your use case. That's why I'll discuss more conceptual approach. So this talk, as I said before, is guidelines. It's not dogmatic approach. It's not a book you should follow. It's, as I said before, it's not just about meta. It's about, you know, you can find it for major corporation or a small project as well. So in general, I find there are 5 types of open source work you can do. And I kind of briefly touched on them. So first type towards improving the open source project health is planning, branding, documentation, and code base. And I'll leave code base for the last. By the way, note, it's 4, I mentioned 5. If you can guess what the 5th one will be, don't say that out loud, but if you guess it, just raise your hand afterwards. Alrighty, so let's start with the planning. Probably the most important, not probably, it is the most important. As I said, we have a portfolio of 800 projects at least, and obviously the planning one comes to be the biggest blocker, the thing that I talk to the project owners the most. It's really the question I have to ask them, why are they doing open source? Because often it's just, the reasoning might be, I would say silly, but something that just doing it for the sake of doing it. It's never a good approach, because it's not going to stick. It's not going to work out. You might it's the same with software. You might send it out in a while, but if you don't maintain, if you don't figure out what's the goal behind it, it's not going to end anywhere other than like being deleted or read-only mode later on. So what are the possible goals I recommend to the teams, for the teams to consider? I don't ever assign them the goal. I ask them to go back to the drawing board, discuss it between themselves, and figure out what they want to do. So first can be recruiting, right? I really like that example with Adobe, because Adobe had an issue where, I mean, still has to some extent, where people might say, oh, some of your software people have pirated for years, you can find free versions of, but they don't fight it too much. They say a person will use maybe Photoshop or whatever other software for the personal use, maybe not acquired through proper licensing, but then when they come work for a company, they will know our product, they will know our software, and be able to use it in the proper licensed way. Has been their approach before. The same can be said about open source too. It can be the fact that you used, let's say, one of our projects like React or PyTorch, and then you go and some people are excited to work on the project within a team, like teams at Meta, or using the project while they work for other organizations. And it's also a great way to get experience. The recruiting is always complicated because people are looking for experience. How to get experience without work? It's this catch-22 situation. So that's one of the ways. Contributions, again, it's similar to what I just said. But here the team behind the project might be looking for contributions to improve productivity, right? Because they're not handling all the use cases. As I said before, it might be they're covering Android use case for themselves, but they're looking for iOS and vice versa. So that's, again, one of the goals the team has in mind. Another one is branding. It's, again, the brand of their team. We have a major open source behind us. Join our team, make a difference. That can be one of the brandings for the team and for the organization. So that's a good goal to keep in mind and be honest about it. And last goal can be adoption. You're actually trying to, maybe you're not looking for contributions. These goals don't, doesn't mean you have to just pick one. You can pick several, but you don't have to pick all of them either. You can just look for adoption, but not looking for contributions. So as long as you make it clear with the team and they know exactly what they're looking for, we're going to get somewhere. So we always have to think long term. It's exciting to think about open sourcing, making something public, but you have to think about winding it down one day. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to, move it to a broader community, or are you going to make it read-only, sunset the project? Think about it as well, because it all comes to full circle one day. So, but very important with the team that works on that is to figure out whether they're actually passionate about it and whether they want to be committed to open source. If it's just an afterthought and just a good thing to have, it's not going to work well. So that's really where planning comes in. And it's important to ask these questions and be honest about them. The next type of open source work I've seen that goes towards improving open source health is the branding. And I mentioned branding a couple times by now, but really branding is a special type of work. It's not just about marketing. It's really about showing commitment. It doesn't mean you have to hire, a team of 10 marketers to work on your project. It's the fact that you show that you thought of the name, of the logo, and everything else in between. As I said, it be a name, something that's searchable, something that's nice. It doesn't have to be searchable, but it's good to have. If you were to search for your project name and you find 50 other things that are just popular, it might be hard to find your project. But again, it just shows that you thought of the name. Logo, it also shows your commitment. It doesn't have to, again, be from the hired designer. It can be within your team. Again, it's another way to involve your community. Ask them to help building it, writing, drawing. It can be a narrative too. Have an overall narrative. If you have several projects, figure out how they work together, how you're going to present them to your community. Don't think of them as isolated pieces. Have a narrative behind that. And lastly, maybe even reserve social media handles. Whether you'll use them or not, it's a separate discussion altogether, but at least reserve the names. Give an example. We have I would say, highly popular project, DocuSource. This is their logo. If you want to learn more about DocuSource, there's a link. But anyways, and by the way, go to Meta Open Source booth. You can find more about our open source projects there. But back to this topic. See this logo? Very nice. People love it. They will even get plushes. You can also think about swag when you're designing something. But it wasn't the beginning. The beginning, we had this. We had someone in the community drew this dinosaur. It is a dinosaur. Drew this dinosaur. So you can think it doesn't have to be perfect. It's like with anything that I've seen, not just in tech, but with anything you do. Just do it. Just do it and see how it works, rather than trying to make it perfect. It doesn't work if you're trying to, that perfection, whether it stifles innovation, whatever. I'm sure there is a cool quote out there about it, but you know what I mean here. Documentation is another important thing, and I already mentioned it. It's the cornerstone of open source. There is, we've analyzed in the past some of the top projects. If you go to GitHub, you would find that most of them will have proper documentation, especially certain type of documentation, which I'll touch on. So, as I said, it's what makes or break the project, because if people don't know how to use it and how it works, will they actually work with it? Not really. So, it's great for contributions, especially first-time contributions. It makes it, try to make it searchable, because it's unlikely someone will go to your docs and tries to read it end to end, just like they would read a book, right? They would usually go to your documentation because they're trying to find answer to a question or situation they are facing. Think of it like as a guide or tutorial, the same approach. You're trying to find a solution to one problem they're facing. So try to make it searchable. With that, we always recommend people to have a website. Docusaurus is a great tool. It's a quick way to build a website and make it searchable, documentation searchable. Also, consider using something like Alex.js, linters like that that really find wording that's not really welcoming. So run your documentation through that. It's also a great way to contribute to the project because you might run it on your own and make a pull request and see, make some alterations and ultimately make a major change to someone else's project or your own project. And last but not least is code base. The code base is an interesting one. It's the first thing we think about, but I don't want to talk about it as the first thing. That being said, there are important things there. Code of conduct, we have it in every single project. I mentioned we have 800 or so. Every single one of them will have a code of conduct. It's extremely important because the main thing, like we have a mission of empowering diverse communities through open source. You can't have diverse communities unless you have code of conduct and you're working towards making your community welcoming and comfortable for all. So code of conduct is one of the, I wouldn't say it's the only thing, but it's one of the first main steps you have to take. README, it's the thing people will see first when they go to your repository. It's the place where there are many resources out there, how to write it. There are many tools on helping you to write the proper README, what the project is, why they should use it, how to use it, really quick, brief documentation there. Contributors guide, if you are looking for contributions, say it in the contributors guide. Explain how they can do it, how they can build it. Don't keep it in a silo that only one person in the company knows. If you're making it open source, you have to think about it. And lastly, if you're working with pull requests and issues, and as you can see, they piling up, think about the feedback loop. If your first response to a pull request or an issue is what are the reproduction steps, like how do you reproduce the issue, what are the results, you should not waste time on that type of communication. Instead, have a template. Fortunately, we have platforms like GitLab, GitHub, where you can implement templates. So when a person files a request, pull request, or an issue, they'll have to fill out, they'll be recommended to fill out a certain information that will help you as the maintainer, as an owner, or as a user of the project. So, who guessed it? Has anyone guessed it? Okay, I'll say this is community work. Has anyone guessed it? Just raise your hand. No one guessed it. Okay, that's good though. When it comes to community work, and community, as I said, it's the key to open source. It has to be team-driven, right? Especially at the beginning. I don't mean the engineering team that might have open sourced, but members of the project. Has to come from them as well. People should feel that they've been mentored. There are tags on your pull requests, or not pull requests, but on the issues, like first good issue is usually a good way to start. Or you as the owner, maintainer of the project, you know that you can fix something really quickly within an hour or so, maybe even less than that. But instead of you fixing that, pair with someone newer to the project and make the change, even if it takes you longer. And that way you'll ultimately grow. You'll go through this funnel of this new person becoming core member of your community. So think about it, but it has to come from the team behind the project. Focus on content, especially early on. Documentation can be considered like one of the type of content, especially if you put like tutorials and guides in there. But people will be searching for answers, for issues that they're facing. Write up about that, right? There are many platforms out there like dev.to and many other places you can write about your project. Also, you can just go to your repository too, or Docusaurus has a blogging section in there too. Okay, you can also, and it's very important to build community space, so a place where people can chat. But it's also important to keep people comfortable there and welcoming. That's where code of conduct come into play. So maybe Slack or Discord, whatever else. I always mix up Discord and Discourse, but one or another. The place where people can go, chat with one another, ask questions. So it's not just forum somewhere random. It's a place you will send them to. Have it on your website, have it on your GitHub repository. Lastly, and very importantly, talk to people, talk to your community, figure out what their issues are, what they're trying to solve, and work with them. All right, so call to action, and we go to the Q&A. Really focus on communication, talk to your team internally. If you are supporting an open source team, make sure they go through the steps I just mentioned. Make sure they have a plan, they have an idea behind their project, and also talk with your community too. What are their goals? What are they looking for? Know your community. One of the great things I like about what React's been doing lately is the work groups. Actually been pulling information from the community, working with them on the features and knowing what they want. And I mean, even though there is no silver bullet, as I said, there is no one metric that fits everyone's project, still collect it. Figure out what works for you. What's the way you can explain and justify open source to your company. Depending on your goal, figure out what metrics you're looking for. If it's recruiting, connect it with the survey at the end of them being hired, and let's say you ask them, was the open source a major reason you joined the company A, right? And if the recruiting was your goal, here is the metrics to back it up. If it's about adoption, look at the number of downloads of your package, whatever it might be, NPM package or something else entirely. So figure out what you're looking for. Contributions, how many contributors you have, right? So it all depends on your goal, but it has to start with planning all the way to actually, getting the feedback and improving. So it's the circle, actually. It's not one-way street. So this is about me. You can always reach out to me and ask me questions, but I would rather go to the Q&A. So thank you for listening, though. I appreciate it.